Death and Dying, The Ancient Chinese Perspective by Sebastian Henderson. Outline: historical overview, concept of the soul, funeral rituals, ancestral tablets, and holidays. Hello, I'm Sebastian Henderson. I'm going to be your thanatologist, someone who studies death and dying. You can also look at me as a death educator. Let us start. First, we're going to look at the historical overview of ancient Chinese death and dying and funeral traditions. The first evidence of these is in the Neolithic period, from 7000 to 1600 BC. There's the Yangshao culture, where people were buried in earthen pit tombs with clay pottery that oftentimes depicted fish, most likely because they were buried and lived near the coastline, and the Lingzhou culture. It's the earliest example of jade objects being buried with the deceased. Jade is oftentimes associated with considerable wealth and status. These practices, as we'll continue to see, are in stark contrast with the West, where there's a greater emphasis on the oftentimes crippling phenomena of grief or the emotional response to death. It's most likely that through these offerings and through these rituals, the ancient Chinese were better able to consolidate and deal with their grief. Let's continue. The Shang dynasty from 1600 to 1050 BCE. We begin to see bronze in this age. Bronze ritual vessels, in fact. The elite members of society, such as the Shang kings and queens, were offered bronze gifts in their tombs. Liu Hao, who was the wife of King Wu Ding, and her tomb, discovered in 1976, fairly recently, contained numerous bone and jade objects. Continuing into the Zhou dynasty, long-lived, from 1050 to 221 BCE, we begin to see much, much greater bronze accessibility. And as a result of the greater accessibility of bronze, far less wealthy people could be buried with bronze offerings. And then we have the incredible example of Marquis Yi of Zhang, feudal king buried with bronze offerings, and a staggering collection of 64 musical bells, all of which were individually tuned. Brings us to the short-lived Qin dynasty from 221 to 210 BC. We'll begin to see miniature figurines, where human sacrifices start to be replaced with offerings of wood figurines. And in another staggering example of the tomb of the first emperor, where Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi was buried with close to 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors representing soldiers during life. This finally brings us to the final age of ancient China, the Han Dynasty, 210 BCE to 221 to 20, Common Era. So we see the Minghui. These were burial goods that were meant to provide the deceased with similar feelings to their lives. Examples were figurines, instruments, common utensils like forks and knives, and weapons. A good example is Lady Di, where in the tomb of this aristocratic lady were everyday objects like Minghui, which broke with the much more extravagant Qin Dynasty offerings. Now, after having looked at all this, let's begin to look at the concept of the soul, starting with yin and yang. The yin-yang symbol is a representation of the Taoist philosophy of the harmony between opposing forces in the universe. Yin is earth, darkness, passivity, and yang is heaven, light, and activity. In the Western perspective, there's the concept of acceptance, where no positive or negative emotions regarding death are left in someone who is about to die. They have reached peace. I would imagine in earlier ancient Chinese traditions, acceptance was reached much earlier. Continuing, the concept of Hun and Po. The Taoist belief that within every person are 3 Hun souls and 7 Po souls. Hun are ethereal souls associated with yang that escape body upon death, and Po are tangible souls associated with yin that remain within the body upon death. We'll be focusing on those in the next couple slides. Po, that is. Funeral rituals, preparing for death. Preparation for a funeral actually involves, it begins before the death of the person involved. At times, the coffin will already have been prepared, even kept within the residence. When death is near, they are placed on a mat or hay in more rural areas with their feet facing the front door. This is in stark contrast to our Western perspective, where we have home care, which is an alternative to hospitalization for end-of-life care. Very different in ancient China. And the whole idea of DNR, do not resuscitate, which would have been very unlikely to see things like this in ancient China, where death was approached far more meaningfully and with more dignity. Continuing on, funeral rituals, it's body preparation. The face of the deceased is washed first, and then the body. Their bodies oftentimes covered in talcum powder, dressed in their finest clothes. They are then placed in a coffin, usually made from an old tree trunk. In ancient China, a lot of the time, when someone was approaching death, they would have a silk thread put in front of their mouth. And when the silk thread ceased its trembling, where the person had stopped breathing, it meant they had died. This breaks from the Western perspective, where we have the idea of functional death, absence of heartbeat and breathing, brain death, cessation, while brain signals measured electrically. This brings us to color symbolism. During funerals, people wear different clothes. White with mourning, red of joy was most likely avoided. Interestingly, black was also avoided, which breaks from the West. Navy is associated with respect, and peoples with long life. Brings us to the wake. Coffin is placed in the house or in the courtyard. They died away from home. They're a warrior or merchant, for example. Nobody wears jewelry. And Tess is burned by funeral guests. Oftentimes, joss paper is burned too. It's a form of spirit money that enables the deceased to gain favor in the afterlife. Through these rituals, it was a lot easier for ancient Chinese people to come to terms with the objective fact of death, which in the Western world is known as bereavement. Brings us to ancestral tablets, ritual exorcism. Likely originated in the Han Dynasty, where the names of ancestors are inscribed on tablets as they symbolize their spirit. They're inscribed on by a close family member, usually of impeccable character, during a ritual that involves them holding their breath as they paint the deceased's name. Through rituals like this, and through keeping these ancestral tablets in people's homes, it's very likely that they were able to avoid the Western phenomenon known as complicated grief, or grief that continues for months or years. Through praying to these ancestral tablets, it was most likely a lot easier for ancient Chinese people to avoid phenomena like complicated grief. Continue on to holidays. The Qingming Festival, also known as Tomb Sweeping Day, takes place on the 15th day after spring equinox. The day is devoted to honoring the dead, making offerings, and focusing on filial piety. After visiting tombs and graves, picnics are usually enjoyed. Through the observance of these holidays, it was probably much easier for ancient Chinese people to avoid Western phenomena like incomplete grief, instances of where someone is incapable of grieving fully. So observing these holidays yearly was a lot easier for the ancient Chinese people. Another holiday was the Hanshi Festival, also known as the Cold Food Festival. It takes place the day before the Qingming Festival. The day is devoted to remembering deceased loved ones and oftentimes involved abstaining from cooked food for 3 days. In conclusion, ancient Chinese beliefs and traditions on death and dying contrast with Western tradition for two main reasons. Death is not the end, but part of a natural cycle, and funeral rituals are more focused on the deceased than the living. Wishes for my own death. As a result of my distaste for Western traditions around death and dying, such as for funerals and the amount of money put into them, I've decided that I'd like my death to be honored more meaningfully. The Bo people of China, who likely disappeared by 1573 AD, had a fascinating way of honoring their dead. They would hoist the deceased in coffins up mountains with ropes and strategically place wood stakes and leave them in cracks in the mountains, which is genuinely a labor of love of wonderful proportions. As such, I'd like to be hoisted upon a sheer cliff face by the most athletic descendants I have, placed precariously before the heavens. Thank you.